He stepped out of the aircraft under the pale lights of the Melbourne tarmac, his wrists locked in steel, his expression unreadable. The wind pushed against the loose fabric of his hoodie, drawing a thin line between the man and the officers on either side of him. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, only the steady movement of three silhouettes descending a narrow flight of metal stairs. It was a quiet moment, almost subdued, yet something in that silence felt deeply unsettling. Rodrigo Elices did not look like someone who had just crossed 4 countries in an attempt to avoid Australian authorities. He did not appear exhausted or frantic. If anything, he moved with a kind of resigned composure, as though he had rehearsed this return long before the aircraft touched down. His face held no anger, no fear, not even relief. The absence of emotion was what gave the scene its weight. It suggested a man accustomed to pressure, comfortable in the unknown, and disturbingly at ease with the consequences now circling around him. The officers, members of specialist units familiar with high-risk escorts, kept a firm grip on him as they reached the asphalt. Their presence was controlled, their gestures efficient. There was no need for intimidation. The moment spoke for itself. For 2 years, investigators in New South Wales and overseas agencies had worked to track his movements, following fragments of information across borders and through air terminals. They had watched his name surface in intelligence briefings, disappear into gaps between jurisdictions, then resurface again somewhere unexpected. This landing in Melbourne marked the end of that pursuit, but it was also the beginning of something far more difficult to comprehend. Behind this return lay the allegations. Firearms, prohibited weapons, kilograms of narcotics. A network that investigators believed had stretched through Sydney's criminal underworld with a level of coordination that did not emerge overnight. The quantity of material seized during the Kensington search alone had raised alarms inside law enforcement circles. Multiple firearms, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and volumes of illicit substances that pointed to more than simple opportunism. Yet these details, as serious as they were, did not fully explain the sense of unease that followed the man now stepping across the airport apron. The deeper disturbance came from what sat between the facts, the gaps. The years in which a figure like Elices could move through communities, workplaces, and social networks without drawing sustained attention. It came from the idea that a person might grow into a position of influence within an organized crime structure slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, until the consequences became impossible to ignore. That quietness lingered now, as the officers guided him towards the waiting vehicle, its engine humming steadily in the background. In those few moments, questions rose that went beyond the charges themselves. How had this man reached such a point? What allowed him to become embedded so deeply that his alleged activities spanned several jurisdictions and required international cooperation to contain? Why had it taken so long for authorities to close in, despite indicators that, in hindsight, seemed to point towards a trajectory that was never going to resolve itself? These were not questions aimed solely at one man, but at the systems surrounding him. The legal structures, social expectations, and institutional blind spots that allowed gaps to form in the first place. His journey across Thailand, the Philippines, Abu Dhabi, and attempted links toward other destinations was not the most disturbing part of his story. Those movements, however complex, were only the final chapters of a process that had begun long before airport checkpoints and extradition procedures. The more troubling reality was that the foundation of this path had been built gradually, through years in which warning signs may have drifted past unnoticed or unconnected. A man does not arrive at this point abruptly. He accumulates experiences, influences, pressures, and choices that shape him long before his name appears in a briefing folder. As the officers closed the vehicle door and the convoy prepared to leave the airport grounds, the scene settled into an uneasy stillness. It was tempting to treat this as the climax, the moment the chase ended and accountability began. But the truth was more complex. The significance of this case could not be understood by looking only at the arrest or the allegations. It required a return to where the trajectory first shifted, where external pressures and internal decisions began steering him away from ordinary pathways and towards something far more dangerous. To grasp the full weight of what led to this night on the Melbourne tarmac, we need to step back, far before the border alerts and the surveillance reports. We need to look at the early years, at the environment that shaped him, and at the subtle shifts that, in time, became turning points. That is where the story truly begins, long before his name appeared in police briefings or crossed international borders. Rodrigo Elices was a boy growing up in the outer stretches of Sydney, surrounded by the ordinary clutter of suburban life mixed with the quieter shadows that have long shaped parts of New South Wales. His early years did not stand out in any significant way to those who met him. He was described as reserved, sometimes difficult to read, but not disruptive. There was nothing that signalled a predetermined path. What existed instead was a young person navigating a landscape that could feel both predictable and unsettled at the same time. Sydney, in the late 90s and early 2000s, carried a contrast that was difficult to ignore. On the surface, the city was expanding, modernising, absorbing waves of new development. Families settled into growing suburbs, children cycled through school routines, and neighbourhoods adopted the rhythms that make life appear stable. Yet, beneath that surface was an undercurrent that had threaded itself quietly through parts of the state for decades. Certain pockets of Nordszeeland were shaped by long-standing tensions between community identity, economic pressure, and the presence of outlaw motorcycle groups whose influence often drifted just out of view but never fully disappeared. For a child trying to understand where he fit, this mixture could be confusing. Rodrigo grew up within reach of these competing forces. His household was not affluent, nor was it marked by severe instability. It sat somewhere in the middle, like many families balancing work, bills, and the challenges of raising children in an environment that could seem supportive one minute and unpredictable the next. His parents worked long hours, leaving him with stretches of time that he often filled alone. Neighbours recalled a boy who kept to himself, more comfortable at a distance than in the centre of attention. Solitude became routine rather than exception. In many suburbs around Sydney, the lines between mainstream youth culture and the fringes of street identity were not always clear. Local parks, skate spots, and small shopping strips were social hubs where older teenagers and young adults drifted in and out. Some carried the influence of bikie-associated aesthetics, patched jackets, modified utes, and a sense of authority that came from belonging to something larger than themselves. To a child watching from outside, these figures could appear both intimidating and strangely magnetic. They represented confidence, a form of certainty, and a clear identity in a world where belonging often felt abstract. As Rodrigo moved through primary school into adolescence, he encountered the same day-to-day pressures that shape many young people: the need to fit in, to find reliable friendships, to understand his own strengths and limitations. Teachers noted he was neither especially outgoing nor noticeably troubled. He performed adequately in class, but rarely pushed himself. His quietness made him easy to overlook, and in a busy school environment, students who caused no disruption often slipped beneath the radar. It was not neglect, but rather the natural consequence of institutions stretched across large cohorts. The broader cultural climate events around during these years added a subtle tension. Synthetic drugs were becoming more common, and discussions about gang-related incidents occasionally surfaced in evening news bulletins. None of this directly involved Rodrigo at that stage. Yet, the stories contributed to a landscape in which certain behaviors, attitudes, and power structures were normalized in ways that could influence a developing mind. When communities adapt to the steady presence of criminal subcultures, even if those subcultures are not directly visible, young people can absorb the atmosphere without fully recognizing its impact. Rodrigo's teenage years were marked by increasing independence. He spent time in local hangouts where groups of older boys gathered, some of whom carried themselves with an authority that came from family ties or social links to biker culture. These figures were not overtly hostile, nor did they openly discuss illegal activity in front of younger teenagers. But their presence set a tone. Conversations frequently circled around toughness, loyalty, and reputation. Admiration for people who seemed fearless or self-assured was common, and Rodrigo, quiet as he was, paid attention. Loneliness also played a quiet role in shaping his inner world. Being on the fringes of social circles meant he often observed interactions rather than participated in them. This kind of distance can push a young person in several directions. Some retreat into their own interests. Others search for a place where silence is not a weakness but an accepted trait. For Rodrigo, the desire to belong eventually outweighed the comfort of isolation. What he sought was not necessarily excitement or rebellion, but an identity that felt stable, something that carried weight in the eyes of others. By his mid-teens, he had started to mimic the style and mannerisms of the older youths he looked up to. It was subtle at first. The way he carried himself, the clothes he chose, the increasingly direct tone he used in conversations. These were not indicators of criminal intent, but rather the behaviors of a young person trying to project confidence while still figuring out who he was. Adults in his life noticed the changes, but interpreted them as typical adolescent shifts. Nothing suggested immediate concern, and any hint of unease could easily be attributed to the natural process of growing up. Across Nesorbalus, communities were already familiar with the presence of organized groups linked to outlaw motorcycle clubs. Their activities were not openly discussed, but people knew which streets to avoid at certain hours and which pubs had reputations for attracting particular crowds. It was a background hum, noticeable yet distant. Rodrigo, like many teenagers in similar neighborhoods, internalized this environment. He learned the unspoken rules: who demanded respect, who could be approached, and who should be avoided. These lessons were absorbed not through direct teaching, but through consistent exposure. During this period, Rodrigo's sense of belonging began to shift. He found acceptance among individuals who valued silence, loyalty, and an ability to adapt quickly. They did not ask many questions, and they did not expect him to explain himself. The appeal of such spaces cannot be underestimated for someone who had spent much of his early life on the margins. It provided structure without explicit boundaries, and purpose without formal expectations. There was no immediate red flag, no single turning point that clarified where these influences would eventually lead him. It was a gradual shaping, formed through repeated contact and subtle pressures that were easy to overlook. His relationships at home and school remained generally intact, though not deeply personal. He was not known for confiding in others, and he rarely expressed frustration. This made it difficult for those around him to recognize the internal shifts taking place. To them, he appeared steady, perhaps slightly distant, but not at risk. The absence of confrontation or behavioral disruption created a sense of comfort that, in retrospect, obscured the earliest signs of change. As he entered early adulthood, the environment around him continued to evolve. Sydney's organised crime landscape grew more complex, driven by increasing demand for synthetic substances and competition among groups seeking control of distribution networks. News reports highlighted tensions between various factions. Yet, these stories often felt disconnected from everyday life. For young men like Rodrigo, however, these dynamics formed part of the social fabric. They influenced conversations, shaped aspirations, and altered perceptions of what success might look like. By this stage, the line between ordinary life and the world operating beneath it had blurred. Rodrigo moved with a confidence that suggested he had found a place where he felt understood, even if that place existed on the edges of conventional stability. Nothing outwardly dramatic marked this transition. The shifts were small, incremental, and easy to dismiss. Yet, something in his trajectory hinted that the path ahead would not remain ordinary for long. For now, everything on the surface appeared manageable. He lived quietly, kept to familiar areas, and maintained a routine that would have seemed unremarkable to anyone observing from a distance. But there was a subtle undertone, a sense that the influences shaping him were slowly tightening their hold. What looked normal carried a faint edge, the kind that suggests a future turning point still hidden from view. Everything, at this stage, appeared almost ordinary. But something beneath that ordinariness felt slightly out of place, as though the foundations were shifting in ways no one had yet noticed. By the time Rodrigo entered his late teens, the quiet detachment that had marked his childhood began to shift into something more outward-facing. He spent longer hours away from home, gravitating towards older men who occupied the fringes of local authority. These individuals were familiar to many in the area, recognized not through formal titles, but through reputation. Their presence often signaled influence that exceeded their numbers. The connection between them and outlaw motorcycle groups was not openly discussed, but it also wasn't a secret. Young men who wanted to project confidence often mimicked their dress, their tone, or the way they carried themselves. Rodrigo's attraction to that world was not sudden. It developed in small increments. He found himself included in conversations he had previously only listened to from the edges. He joined groups at service stations, back alleys behind industrial blocks, or quiet corners of public parks where older members would gather. These meetings were rarely dramatic. There were no visible displays of criminal behavior in front of outsiders, and nothing that immediately warranted intervention. But the atmosphere suggested boundaries that differed from the ones he had known at school or home. Exposure to this environment brought new behaviors. He started adopting the language used by these groups. His posture changed. He became more assertive, less inclined to ask questions, more comfortable blending into a hierarchy where understanding unspoken rules mattered. While teachers and family noticed increased confidence, they didn't interpret it as a sign of risk. Many young men in similar suburbs moved through comparable phases. The distinction between normal adolescent bravado and early alignment with organized groups was subtle, and it often depended on context that adults simply didn't have. It was around this time that Rodrigo formed looser but increasingly consistent connections to individuals associated with the Hells Angels. The links were not direct at first. They came through social circles, acquaintances, and community events where members or associates appeared. In neighborhoods where these groups maintained a presence, it wasn't unusual for teenagers to see patched members or supporters at local pubs or automotive workshops. For some, the sight triggered caution. For others, including Rodrigo, it represented a form of certainty he had been searching for. As he moved into early adulthood, Rodrigo began running small errands for people who needed tasks completed quietly and without attention. These errands did not immediately relate to anything overtly illegal. They involved delivering messages, transporting small packages, or providing company on long drives where discretion was valued. To him, these tasks offered inclusion. To those giving them, he was useful precisely because he didn't draw suspicion. His low-key demeanor and ability to follow instructions without complaint made him reliable. From these early tasks, a pattern formed. Rodrigo became someone who could be called upon when a job required a steady presence. This reliability expanded into favours that edged closer to the criminal landscape, though still not enough to draw direct scrutiny. He began facilitating small exchanges. Items passed from one person to another, under the assumption that their contents were not to be questioned. He was not required to ask where the packages came from or where they were going. The ability to not ask became part of his value. In social settings, he encountered men who carried alleged associations with the Hells Angels. They rarely disclosed specific details, but the symbolism was present. Patches worn on the back of jackets, coded phrases, shared loyalties spoken about in measured tones. Rodrigo was attentive. He had spent years learning how to observe quietly, and these skills now provided him with access to a world he had only glimpsed from afar. He liked the structure it offered. There were roles, expectations, and a sense of belonging tied to loyalty rather than emotional vulnerability. Alongside this slow integration came exposure to substances that circulated widely among certain groups. Synthetic drugs had become increasingly common in Necesariclus, and the line between distribution and personal use could blur easily. Rodrigo encountered these substances first through social spaces, where experimentation was framed as part of fitting in. Over time, he became familiar with the logistics behind supply, who sourced what, who delivered, and which substances moved fastest through particular neighborhoods. His involvement evolved not through a single decision, but through repeated participation in smaller, seemingly insignificant tasks. With each year, Rodrigo drifted further from the structured expectations of mainstream life. He worked intermittently, often in casual jobs that accommodated irregular hours. His relationships with family members grew more distant. They saw less of him, and when he was present, he offered little insight into how he spent his time. Friends from school noticed the changes, but struggled to articulate their concerns. Some felt uneasy about the people he spent time with, but hesitated to voice their doubts, unsure whether they were overreacting. Warnings surfaced in subtle forms. A neighbor once commented on the number of unfamiliar vehicles parked near Rodrigo when he arrived home late at night. A former teacher recognized him outside a pub, known for its connections to Bikie groups, and later described the encounter as unsettling, though not alarming enough to report. Youth services workers occasionally crossed paths with young men in Rodrigo's circles, but without concrete indicators of risk, intervention was limited. The systems in place relied on escalation, and Rodrigo remained calm, compliant, and largely invisible. By his early 20s, he had become a quiet participant in an ecosystem where criminality existed as a backdrop rather than an overt display. The individuals around him did not announce their affiliations, but their reputations traveled through communities. Rodrigo learned to navigate these spaces with increasing confidence. He understood the expectations placed upon him. He knew when to remain silent, when to act, and when to disappear briefly to avoid drawing attention. These behaviors, while noticeable to those closest to him, did not trigger formal concern. Many communities across Necesariclus had become accustomed to the presence of outlaw motorcycle groups. Their activities were often contained within boundaries that local residents could predict. Rodrigo's gradual alignment with these networks didn't manifest in open conflict or erratic behavior. Instead, it unfolded through consistent exposure, subtle encouragement, and small acts that accumulated meaning only in hindsight. His early interactions with weapons were similarly understated. They occurred in controlled environments where older members emphasized safety and discretion. Rodrigo handled firearms under supervision, not for explicit criminal acts, but as part of the broader culture surrounding the groups he admired. These experiences strengthened his standing among peers and reinforced the identity he had been shaping for years. The sense of belonging deepened. There were moments, small ones, when the trajectory might have been interrupted. A friend expressed concern after witnessing an argument that escalated faster than expected. A relative suggested he consider steady work to build a more stable future. A local community worker offered guidance during an informal conversation. Rodrigo listened, nodded, and offered polite reassurances. None of these exchanges carried enough urgency to shift his direction. The path he was on felt, to him, like the first place where he truly fit. As his 20s progressed, the gap between his outward appearance and his internal alignment widened. He still moved quietly, still maintained a calm facade, still avoided unnecessary confrontation. But the people he spent time with, the tasks he accepted, and the perspective he adopted were increasingly shaped by a world that demanded loyalty above all else. His sense of identity had become intertwined with it. This was the period when the slide became clear to those observing closely, not through dramatic events, but through accumulated signals. The company he kept, the hours he kept, the confidence he displayed in environments others avoided. None of it erupted into immediate danger, but the direction was unmistakable. It was the point at which intervention might have changed everything. The moment when someone could still have reached him before the deeper commitment set in. Instead, the signs drifted past, unconnected. Rodrigo continued forward, shaped by the influences that had surrounded him for years. The groundwork was set, and the path ahead was beginning to narrow, preparing him for choices that would decide everything that followed. By the time Rodrigo Elices entered his late 20s, the world around him had changed in ways that placed him squarely within the operational sphere of Sydney's criminal landscape. According to police allegations, his involvement was no longer limited to peripheral tasks or minor exchanges. He had begun to play a more deliberate role, one shaped by growing connections, accumulated trust, and an increasing willingness to move in circles where authority was defined internally rather than by any formal institution. The calm, observant teenager he once was had evolved into someone who reportedly operated with a sense of purpose, shaped by years of exposure to personalities who valued influence, resources, and control. Investigators later described this period as the point where his trajectory accelerated. The word was chosen carefully. It implied movement rather than sudden transformation, acknowledging the gradual progression that had preceded it. Through the networks he had spent years circulating around, Rodrigo allegedly found access to the infrastructure that enabled more serious operations. These networks, according to police, were linked to the supply and distribution of firearms and illegal substances across parts of Sydney. The seriousness of these allegations signalled a significant shift from the quiet, understated activities of his earlier years. What set this stage apart was the structure that investigators observed. Police intelligence suggested that Rodrigo was not simply an assistant or courier, but someone with decision-making authority. They alleged he coordinated movements, delegated responsibilities, and operated with enough understanding of the broader framework to shield himself from immediate detection. Such roles, even in a loosely organized network, required precision. They involved knowing who could be relied upon, who posed risk, and which environments offered the least resistance. For someone who had spent his life observing and adapting, the skill set matched the requirements. The most significant insight into the scale of this alleged operation emerged on 15th December 2022, when officers executed a search warrant at a property in Kensington. The findings were extensive. Police reported seizing 11 firearms, including several classified as prohibited, alongside more than 1,000 rounds of ammunition. They also located quantities of illicit substances, approximately 4 kilograms of GBL, along with hundreds of grams of MDMA and methamphetamine. The scene painted a picture that stood in sharp contrast to the quiet suburban street outside. It was not an environment associated with spontaneous crime or casual wrongdoing. What officers found appeared organised, prepared, and deliberate. The Kensington search became a turning point in the investigation. It provided tangible evidence supporting allegations of Rodrigo's involvement in a coordinated network. It also intensified efforts by law enforcement to track his movements, given the seriousness of the materials uncovered. GBL, MDMA, and methamphetamine were not substances handled in small-scale exchanges. Their quantities suggested distribution at a level requiring planning, supply channels, and trusted intermediaries. The presence of firearms added another layer of concern. Firearms of this nature rarely appear without purpose in organised groups, and the volume of ammunition indicated preparedness rather than experimentation. The Raptor Squad, a specialist NS-Dedaland police unit focused on dismantling organised criminal groups and targeting individuals linked to outlaw motorcycle clubs, took a central role in the investigation. Their approach was methodical. They examined financial movements, communication patterns, vehicle registrations, and the flow of goods across suburbs. In public comments, officers from the unit stated that there was nowhere out of reach when dealing with those suspected of involvement in weapons and drug supply networks. The statement was not dramatic. It reflected a commitment to pursuing individuals considered to pose systemic risk to community safety. During this period, Rodrigo's movements became increasingly difficult for authorities to trace. Investigators alleged that he used false documentation to facilitate travel and access various jurisdictions without triggering immediate alarms. The use of such documents required planning and access to contacts capable of supplying them. It also indicated an awareness of surveillance and the need to avoid predictable patterns. These actions intensified the search and prompted cooperation between Australian agencies and overseas authorities. According to police, Rodrigo's activities extended beyond simple survival attempts. They alleged he continued coordinating aspects of the network even while avoiding detection, using intermediaries and encrypted communication channels to maintain distance while still exerting influence. The accuracy of these allegations would ultimately be determined through legal proceedings, but the detail within the intelligence reports showed why authorities treated the case as a priority. The combination of firearms, illicit substances, and cross-border mobility presented a level of complexity not often associated with smaller operations. As the investigation expanded, it became evident that the network Rodrigo was allegedly connected to operated across several layers. At the base were individuals responsible for transport, storage, and low-level distribution. Above them were organisers who coordinated timing, locations, and risk assessments. Further up were those who handled finances, communication, and external relationships. Police alleged that Rodrigo had positioned himself somewhere in the upper tier, directing movement while minimizing personal exposure. This type of structure was not uncommon in organised crime groups within Nestballs, particularly among those with connections to outlaw motorcycle identities. The resilience of such structures often came from decentralization. If one part was compromised, others could continue operating. Despite the scale of the activity alleged by authorities, Rodrigo himself maintained a relatively low public profile. He did not display outward signs of wealth or try to cultivate notoriety. To neighbours and casual acquaintances, he was quiet, composed, and rarely seen in situations that would raise suspicion. This understated presence, combined with his calm demeanour, contributed to the difficulty investigators faced when trying to track him. It also highlighted the contrast between the life he presented and the life he was accused of leading. In the months following the Kensington search, the investigation intensified further. Cross-agency task forces traced potential financial pathways that could explain the movement of funds associated with drug supply operations. They also examined the flow of firearms into NS Organised, looking for patterns that aligned with the seizures made during the search. While the full results of these inquiries would later form part of broader legal proceedings, they provided a clearer picture of the network's reach. For many involved in the investigation, the most confronting element was not the alleged sophistication of the network itself, but the duration over which it had reportedly developed. It forced questions about the ability of existing systems to identify emerging risks early enough to prevent escalation. Rodrigo's journey from a quiet teenager to someone allegedly coordinating significant criminal operations did not occur in isolation. It occurred within a community context that had observed changes but struggled to connect them into a coherent warning. By late 2022, as the investigation closed in, the picture painted by authorities suggested a man operating at a level far removed from the early days of small errands and quiet observation. His alleged use of false passports, his ability to move across borders, and the scale of the materials seized all pointed to an operation that had grown steadily over time. Whether out of caution, confidence, or necessity, he remained difficult to apprehend. The effect of this growth was felt across multiple agencies. The need for coordination, the resources invested, and the risks posed by the quantities of weapons and drugs involved created pressure that extended beyond one individual. It brought into question the thresholds at which intervention becomes unavoidable, and the challenges of recognizing those thresholds early enough. The stage was now set for a wider pursuit, one that would leave Nes Bazilans behind and stretch across several countries. For all the efforts invested into monitoring him locally, Rodrigo had already taken steps that would move the investigation far beyond Sydney's boundaries. In the eyes of law enforcement, he had continued to expand while remaining just outside their grasp. And as his alleged operation grew, the systems meant to contain such growth did not reach him quickly enough. It was this absence, more than anything else, that underscored the urgency of what came next. When the investigation reached its tipping point in late 2022, the focus shifted from understanding the scale of the alleged network to locating the man authorities believed sat near its center. What had begun as a Nesidalu-based inquiry expanded rapidly once it became clear that Rodrigo Elices was no longer within Australian borders. The operations that followed were shaped by uncertainty, tight deadlines, and the need for coordination across jurisdictions whose systems differed in both structure and speed. It was the beginning of a pursuit that moved beyond Sydney's streets and into an international arena where each step forward risked being undone by unforeseen obstacles. The first significant development occurred in Thailand. Australian authorities, working with offshore partners, identified Rodrigo's presence in Bangkok. He had travelled there using documentation that investigators alleged was falsified, enabling him to pass through checkpoints without triggering immediate alerts. For law enforcement, this confirmed earlier concerns about his access to resources capable of supporting cross-border movement. The discovery created a surge of momentum. After months of tracking fragments of information across scattered channels, there was finally a point of contact. On 8 November 2022, Thai police detained Rodrigo for immigration offences. The arrest was not connected to the allegations in Australia, yet it offered a narrow window of opportunity. The news brought a sense of cautious optimism to investigators in Enesadhalv. For the first time, they had physical custody confirmed. The possibility of extradition was raised, though the process would depend on international agreements, legal procedures, and the capacity of each country involved to prioritise the request. In these situations, timing is often as important as evidence. Despite the initial hope, the process did not unfold as swiftly as anticipated. Rodrigo remained in Thai custody for months, while his immigration matters progressed through local channels. The delay created an unexpected challenge. Australia could not intervene directly without following established diplomatic and legal protocols, and Thailand had its own procedures that needed to be completed before any transfer could be considered. During this period, investigators back home continued to gather information, strengthen their case, and monitor developments closely. But as the months passed, uncertainty grew. For many involved, the difficulty lay not in lack of cooperation between agencies, but in the complexity of international legal frameworks. Each decision required assessing risk, accuracy, and jurisdictional boundaries. Communications travelled through formal channels that could be efficient on some days and slow on others. While Rodrigo remained in custody, there was reassurance. Yet, as the case moved into its later stages, the factors governing his status became increasingly unpredictable. After approximately 11 months in detention, Rodrigo received a royal pardon under Thailand's legal system, a mechanism separate from the Australian process and one that allowed him to be released from Thai custody. This moment marked the first major setback in the pursuit. From the perspective of NS Dala's investigators, the situation shifted from relative containment to renewed uncertainty. The hope that had built steadily over the past year began to taper. There was no guarantee that he would remain within reach. The window that had seemed stable was now in danger of closing. Following his release, arrangements were made for Rodrigo to return to Australia. He was placed on a flight that would transit through Manila. On paper, the journey was straightforward. A controlled return supervised through coordinated efforts between agencies. But transit points carry inherent risks. Different jurisdictions, different protocols, and different vulnerabilities can reshape the outcome of an otherwise secure operation. In this case, the transition through the Philippines presented one of the most significant turns in the entire pursuit. While passing through Manila Airport, Rodrigo reportedly complained of illness, prompting local authorities to adjust standard procedures. It was a moment that altered the momentum of the operation significantly. Australian investigators, awaiting confirmation of his progress, learned that the sequence of events had shifted. Instead of continuing on to Australia as scheduled, Rodrigo's circumstances changed, creating uncertainty about his next movements. What had seemed like a controlled return now carried the possibility of evasion. The hours that followed were marked by fluctuating reports. There were suggestions he might have attempted to secure onward travel to Abu Dhabi, then potentially Istanbul, Lebanon, or Taiwan. These possibilities, though not confirmed at the time, reflected the broader challenge of tracking someone familiar with navigating borders irregularly. The idea that he could move again, possibly beyond the reach of any single jurisdiction, created a familiar tension among those coordinating the pursuit. Every avenue had to be checked, verified, and cross-checked, often with limited information. This stage of the hunt encapsulated the cycle that defined much of the investigation. An initial surge of hope, followed by a sudden shift that brought everything back into question. Each development felt close to resolution, only for circumstances to change without warning. International cooperation is essential in these cases, but it is also subject to practical constraints, workload, timing, and the varied priorities of different agencies. Investigators in Neza Dalus had to wait, monitor, and remain prepared to respond whenever the next confirmed detail surfaced. In the weeks that followed, Rodrigo's movements became clearer. Authorities across several regions flagged his presence or attempted movements, though none resulted in long-term detention. The pattern was exhausting for those involved. Near contact followed by distance, confirmation followed by silence. It reflected the inherent difficulty of pursuing someone with alleged access to networks capable of facilitating quick decisions and rapid relocation. Eventually, however, the cycle began to break. Through combined efforts between Australian authorities and international partners, information emerged that Rodrigo was once again on a pathway that restricted his options. The mechanisms that had previously enabled movement, documents, connections, and timing, were narrowing. The systems in place, slow at times, had begun aligning toward a single outcome. The decisive moment came when officials confirmed that he was being placed on a flight destined for Australia. There were no alternative routes, no transit points that allowed deviation, and no immediate avenues for rerouting. It was a controlled journey, monitored from the moment it began until the aircraft reached Australian airspace. For investigators who had spent years navigating uncertainties, the confirmation acted as a point of resolution. The long pursuit across borders, checkpoints, and diplomatic channels had reached its endpoint. When the plane landed in Melbourne, it marked the conclusion of the international phase of the hunt. The relief among investigators was tempered, shaped by the knowledge that the broader case extended far beyond the pursuit itself. But the critical development had occurred. Rodrigo was back under Australian jurisdiction, subject to the legal processes that would follow. After months of setbacks, pauses, and unexpected turns, the chase that had stretched across multiple countries had ended. The moment represented a break in the cycle, an end to the movement that had defined the pursuit and the beginning of a new stage within Australia's legal framework. The long period of uncertainty had given way to a definitive outcome. The path ahead would no longer involve border crossings or international negotiations. It would unfold entirely within the structures designed to examine the allegations that had prompted the hunt in the first place. When the aircraft door opened on 29 November 2024 and police escorted Rodrigo Elices onto the Melbourne tarmac, the public understood only a fraction of the story. For many Australians, it was the first time they had seen his face clearly. Until that moment, he had existed primarily through fragments, overseas reports, brief statements from NS Police, and references to a man allegedly moving across borders to avoid detection. His return brought those fragments together. It marked the beginning of a process in which multiple layers of information, gathered over years, across countries, would finally be examined under a single legal framework. Once he was transferred into Victorian custody and then handed back to New South Wales authorities, investigators began presenting the material that had accumulated throughout the investigation. Police laid a total of 55 charges against him, covering a range of alleged offences related to drugs, firearms, and organised criminal activity. The breadth of these charges was striking, not simply because of the number, but because of how they reflected the scale and complexity of the case. Each charge corresponded to a piece of the broader picture: items seized, movements tracked, relationships identified, and communications analysed. Much of the clarity came from examining what had been found at the Kensington property 2 years earlier. The 11 firearms seized during that search, along with more than 1,000 rounds of ammunition, formed a substantial part of the allegations. Several of the weapons were classified as prohibited under New South Wales law. Their presence raised questions about sourcing, storage, and intended use. Investigators also highlighted the quantities of chemicals and illicit substances located on site, including nearly 4 kilograms of GBL and significant amounts of MDMA and methamphetamine. These quantities suggested a level of organisation consistent with structured supply networks rather than personal possession or isolated activity. When presented together, these findings shaped the narrative that police believed they had uncovered: that Rodrigo had occupied a position of influence within a network connected to the distribution of both weapons and drugs across Sydney. The charges alleged that he had not only facilitated movement within this network, but had also overseen parts of its operation. While these allegations remained subject to the court process, Their presentation provided the public with a clearer understanding of why law enforcement agencies across multiple countries had invested significant resources in pursuing him. The second layer of truth that emerged involved the timeline of Rodrigo's movements before his arrest. After the Kensington search, investigators alleged that he had left Australia using documentation that allowed him to bypass standard alerts. His time in Thailand, the months in custody, the royal pardon, and the complex series of events that unfolded during transit through Manila all became essential elements of the case. Each part of this timeline contributed to the broader argument that he had access to support networks capable of facilitating cross-border movement and evasion. Authorities traced these movements with increasing detail as cooperating agencies provided updated information. They identified attempts by Rodrigo to reach Abu Dhabi and Istanbul following the disruption of his transit plan in the Philippines. Additional leads suggested he may have considered travel to Lebanon or Taiwan. These movements did not stand alone. When placed alongside the material found in Kensington and the alleged role he played in local networks, the international component suggested an operation that extended beyond neighbourhood boundaries. It indicated a level of sophistication that relied on timing, resources, and contacts across multiple regions. Another layer of the unmasking came from examining how his alleged role fit within broader organised crime structures. NS Police linked parts of the investigation to outlaw motorcycle groups, noting alleged associations between Rodrigo and individuals connected to the Hells Angels. This did not mean he held a formal or permanent position within the club. Instead, investigators alleged that he interacted with people who operated at different levels of influence, using those relationships to facilitate the movement of goods. These interactions were important not because they identified him as part of a particular organisation, but because they explained how he might have accessed the resources and protection required to sustain the activities now before the courts. As prosecutors laid out these components, media across Australia began to assemble their own accounts. Headlines referred to the pursuit as one of the most significant manhunts in recent memory. Articles highlighted the 2-year timeline, the number of agencies involved, and the series of international jurisdictions affected by his movements. While the public had been dimly aware of the case prior to his return, the scale only became clear when all the pieces were placed side by side. Journalists noted that it was rare for a single investigation to stretch across so many countries in such a condensed time frame. They also pointed out the complexity of coordinating efforts across different legal systems, each with its own priorities and constraints. Community reaction grew as more details emerged. Many Australians were unsettled by the size of the alleged operation and the quantities of weapons and drugs involved. For families who had lost loved ones to substance misuse, the emotional impact was acute. The case became a reference point in conversations about the availability of synthetic substances, the risks posed by organised crime, and the strain placed on communities that lived closest to the distribution pathways. Some families spoke publicly about their own experiences, not to comment directly on Rodrigo's case, but to highlight the broader harm caused by drug supply networks. Their comments were measured, shaped by personal grief rather than anger, but they added a human dimension to the allegations that statistics alone could not convey. For investigators who had worked on the case from its earliest stages, the unmasking offered both clarity and reflection. They had spent years assembling small pieces of information, verifying reports, and adjusting their approach whenever the situation changed. Seeing the components aligned within a single legal framework allowed them to step back and view the trajectory in full. It showed how a sequence of early decisions, relationships, and opportunities could accumulate over time. It also highlighted the gaps that had allowed the alleged operation to grow before being identified. Those gaps, whether in community awareness, legal oversight, or social support structures became part of a broader conversation. Commentators pointed out that Rodrigo's story did not exist in isolation. It reflected systemic issues that had been visible for years: the rise of organized crime groups in Nestoriles, the increasing complexity of drug distribution networks, and the challenge of intervening early enough to prevent individuals from becoming deeply embedded. These discussions did not aim to excuse the alleged conduct, but to understand the conditions that allowed it to flourish. Within this context, the unmasking extended beyond Rodrigo himself. It drew attention to the systems he had allegedly operated within, the people who had intersected with those systems, and the circumstances that allowed the network to function. It raised questions about early intervention programs, intelligence sharing between agencies, and the pressure placed on communities that lived closest to organized crime activity. It also prompted reflection on the ways international travel routes could be exploited, especially when multiple jurisdictions were involved. For many Australians, the emotional response was shaped less by the allegations themselves and more by the broader implications. The presence of firearms and illicit substances at the scale alleged by police indicated a degree of risk that communities were not always equipped to manage. The idea that such resources could be stored within suburban streets created understandable concern. Combined with the knowledge that Rodrigo had moved across borders for an extended period before being returned to Australia, the public was left to consider how these activities might have continued had the investigation not progressed as it did. By the time police compiled the full sequence of events, beginning with the initial intelligence, progressing through the Kensington search, following the international pursuit, and ending with his return, the case revealed not only a portrait of one individual, but a reflection of broader systemic challenges. The unmasking exposed the network, the pathways, and the vulnerabilities that had made the alleged operations possible. It brought into focus the reality that communities, institutions, and families had been affected long before the public became aware of the name connected to the charges. The significance of this phase lay in its clarity. For the first time, all the components that had once felt fragmented were united. The allegations could now be presented within a structured legal environment, enabling the courts to examine them in detail. At the same time, the public could see the trajectory of a person who had moved through multiple environments: schools, neighborhoods, social groups, international borders, and emerged at the center of a complex criminal investigation. As these layers settled into place, a quiet but persistent question lingered beneath the surface. How had the situation reached this point without earlier intervention? The answer was neither simple nor singular. It involved missed opportunities, structural limitations, and the gradual evolution of choices made across years. Rodrigo's alleged conduct may have brought him into the spotlight, but the ecosystem that enabled that conduct had developed over a far longer period. The unmasking made this visible. It turned what had once been isolated facts into a coherent account, revealing the full extent of what investigators believed had taken place. It showed not only what he was accused of, but the environment that allowed those accusations to carry weight. And as the case moved into its next phase, the focus shifted again, from unveiling the truth to examining how the system would respond to it. When Rodrigo Elices was returned to New South Wales and placed before the courts, the public expectation was that the case would deliver swift resolution. After 2 years of international tracking, months of coordinated intelligence sharing, and a lengthy list of charges, many assumed that the judicial phase would simply formalize what investigators had already compiled. But the courtroom is structured differently from the pursuit. It is slower, more measured, and governed by rules that prioritize procedure above momentum. As the case began, this distinction became clear. The pursuit had ended abruptly. The legal process would not. The prosecution opened with a detailed outline of the 55 charges filed against Rodrigo. These included allegations relating to the possession and supply of prohibited firearms, the supply of illicit drugs, dealing with proceeds of crime, and offences associated with participation in a criminal group. Each charge was supported by material gathered from the Kensington search, surveillance records, statements from officers involved in the investigation, and documentation obtained from international partners. The prosecution's approach was structured, presenting the case as an accumulation of interconnected elements rather than a single dramatic event. Central to the prosecution's argument was the claim that Rodrigo had occupied a supervisory role within a broader network. They argued that he had coordinated logistics for the movement of firearms and drugs, had access to communication systems associated with organized groups, and had relied on trusted intermediaries to maintain distance from direct transactions. While acknowledging that not every detail could be publicly disclosed due to ongoing investigations into other individuals, prosecutors emphasized that the evidence placed Rodrigo in a position of responsibility within the alleged operation. The Kensington search featured heavily in the opening submissions. Prosecutors walked the court through the catalogue of items seized, the 11 firearms, the large volume of ammunition, and the significant quantities of GBL, MDMA, and methamphetamine. Photos and diagrams were presented to establish context, demonstrating where items were found, how they were stored, and what investigators believed these arrangements suggested about planning and intent. The prosecution argued that the structure of the storage, particularly the separation of weapons from substances, indicated deliberate organization rather than disorder or opportunistic behavior. The defense, however, approached the material differently. Their argument focused on the absence of direct evidence linking Rodrigo to daily operations. They noted that none of the seized items bore his fingerprints, and that there was limited surveillance material placing him physically at the Kensington property. They emphasized that association does not equate to command, and that social proximity to individuals involved in organized groups does not automatically prove participation. The defense acknowledged that Rodrigo had spent time with people who were the subject of interest to police, but argued that such relationships were neither unusual nor illegal within certain parts of Sydney. When addressing the international component, prosecutors highlighted Rodrigo's movements through Thailand, the Philippines, and other potential transit points. They argued that the use of false documentation demonstrated an intention to evade Australian authorities. They noted that these movements aligned with periods in which investigators were attempting to secure his return. The defense countered by pointing out that the overseas detentions were based on immigration matters, not Australian criminal allegations, and argued that Rodrigo had expressed willingness to return voluntarily before administrative issues interfered with the process. They described the delays in his return as the product of bureaucratic complications rather than deliberate evasion. As the hearings progressed, attention shifted to the systemic issues that had allowed Rodrigo to travel internationally in the first place. Members of the public, commentators, and legal observers questioned how someone allegedly involved in serious criminal activity could leave the country without triggering border alerts. The prosecution acknowledged that the passport used by Rodrigo had bypassed detection, but emphasized that this issue fell outside the scope of the criminal charges. It was, they said, a matter for internal review within government departments responsible for travel authorization. In response, the defense used the issue to argue that systemic failures could not be attributed to Rodrigo. They stated that his ability to leave the country was a symptom of gaps in the administrative framework, not evidence of criminal ingenuity. The courtroom discussion surrounding this topic became a focal point for broader public debate. Talkback radio programs, opinion pieces, and interviews with former law enforcement officials highlighted concerns about resource limitations, outdated systems, and the growing challenge of monitoring individuals with alleged connections to organised crime groups. Another point of public contention centred on the length of the investigation. Many questioned why it had taken nearly 2 years to bring Rodrigo into custody. Legal analysts explained that the timeline reflected both the complexity of the case and the difficulties involved in coordinating international transfers. Despite these explanations, frustration persisted. For communities affected by drug-related harm, the delay felt like a failure in enforcement capability. For those concerned about the presence of organised crime groups in Nesca, it raised questions about whether existing task forces were equipped to respond effectively. The hearings also brought renewed scrutiny to the influence of outlaw motorcycle groups across the state. The prosecution avoided linking Rodrigo directly to any single group, instead using the term associates and alleged connections. Yet references to the Hells Angels appeared frequently in media reports, shaping public perception. Commentators pointed out that while NS Dalian police had made significant progress through units like the Raptor Squad, the ongoing presence of Bicky gangs underscored the adaptability of these groups. They operated through decentralized structures that allowed members or affiliates to continue activities even when key individuals were arrested. This structure made intervention more difficult and required more sustained resources than many agencies could consistently maintain. During the hearings, evidence was presented regarding communication methods allegedly used within the network. Prosecutors described encrypted messaging applications and coded language, suggesting that these methods were intentionally designed to avoid detection. The defense argued that the presence of encrypted messages did not prove criminal behavior, and that such applications were widely used in the general population. Again, the issue highlighted tensions between legal interpretation and public sentiment. While courts require clear, admissible evidence, communities affected by organised crime often see circumstantial indicators as compelling. The emotional tone of the proceedings shifted as families impacted by drug supply attended some of the hearings. Their presence was quiet but significant. They did not speak in court, nor did they comment publicly, yet their attendance added weight to the social implications of the allegations. For many Australians, the image of families sitting silently in the gallery served as a reminder that the case extended beyond legal definitions. It touched on lives shaped by loss, grief, and long-term harm. Throughout the trial, the issue of resource limitations within the legal and law enforcement systems resurfaced repeatedly in public discussion. Former detectives noted that the demands placed on specialist units had grown significantly over the past decade. The nature of organised crime had shifted, integrating digital communication, international supply chains, and fast-moving financial structures. These elements required specialised training and advanced tools, both of which were expensive and time-consuming to maintain. The prosecution's case reflected this complexity. Drawing on intelligence from multiple regions and requiring consistent collaboration with overseas agencies. As the hearings reached their later stages, the defence sought to challenge the suggestion that Rodrigo's alleged role had been central. They argued that the prosecution had built a narrative based on assumptions about hierarchy rather than concrete evidence. They pointed out that the network described by police was broader than the actions of any single individual, and that structural issues within Nesca created environments where multiple actors could operate simultaneously. They emphasized that Rodrigo should be judged only on the evidence directly linked to him, not the broader concerns surrounding organised crime. The prosecution, however, maintained that the consistent alignment of evidence made the allegations credible. They argued that Rodrigo's movements, the items seized, the communication patterns identified, and the timing of events formed a coherent picture. They acknowledged the systemic issues, but emphasized that these did not negate individual responsibility. The court's role, they said, was not to analyse federal policies or border security systems, but to determine whether the allegations against Rodrigo were supported by admissible evidence. Public debate intensified as the trial neared its conclusion. Some argued that the legal process was too slow and too cautious, allowing individuals accused of serious offences to remain unconvicted for extended periods. Others countered that the complexity of such cases required time, and that rushing proceedings could compromise fairness. Discussions also emerged about whether specialised courts or additional funding for organised crime task forces might improve outcomes. These debates reflected broader concerns about the capacity of institutions to respond effectively to evolving criminal structures. Despite strong public interest, the judiciary maintained its commitment to procedure. Judges reminded observers that allegations must be tested, evidence must be scrutinised, and legal thresholds must be respected. This emphasis on due process, while necessary for fairness, created tension with the public's desire for swift accountability. It highlighted the divide between community expectations and the realities of the legal system. As closing arguments began, the prosecution reiterated its position that Rodrigo had played a central role in a sophisticated network and that the evidence demonstrated clear involvement. The defence responded by urging the court to view the case through a critical lens, warning against accepting connections that had not been proven beyond reasonable doubt. They emphasised the gaps in the evidence, the reliance on inference, and the possibility that systemic failures had contributed to misunderstandings about Rodrigo's movements. When the hearings closed, the courtroom became quiet. The legal representatives had said all they were permitted to say. The judge reserved judgment, as is common in complex cases. Outside the courthouse, the public waited, some with frustration, others with resignation, and many with questions. The case had exposed weaknesses in systems once considered robust. It had highlighted delays, resource constraints, and the difficulties agencies faced when criminal networks evolved faster than the frameworks designed to contain them. In this silence, reflection replaced reaction. Australians were left to consider the broader implications of the case. It was no longer simply a matter of one man's alleged conduct. It had become a window into the realities of a system stretched thin, forced to manage threats that required more than traditional approaches. The case demonstrated the limits of existing structures and raised questions about how those structures might adapt in the future. For some, the dominant emotion was anger. For others, it was concern or uncertainty. But beneath these reactions was a deeper understanding that the pursuit, the charges, and the trial each pointed to a system confronting challenges more complex than any single case could represent. And as the judgment approached, the country waited, not just for a verdict, but for clarity on what the case revealed about the strength, limitations, and future of the system itself. When the final stages of the legal process drew to a close, the country was left to make sense of what the Rodrigo Elices case represented beyond the courtroom. The allegations, the pursuit, and the hearings had occupied public attention for months, yet their significance stretched far further than the immediate facts. What remained was a broader reflection on the systems that had been tested, the communities affected, and the long-term implications for Australia's approach to organised crime. The case had ended its procedural chapter, but its shadow continued to move through conversations, policy discussions, and the quieter corners of everyday life. One of the clearest impacts emerged within the realm of law reform. The scale of the alleged network, the seriousness of the items seized, and the complexity of the international pursuit prompted renewed scrutiny of Australia's existing frameworks for monitoring and controlling organised groups, particularly those linked to outlaw motorcycle identities. Policymakers began examining whether the tools available to law enforcement were sufficient to disrupt operations before they grew into transnational networks. questions surfaced about the adequacy of current anti-association laws, the efficiency of task forces, and the need for updated legislative support to address modern criminal structures. The Elices case served as a catalyst for discussions about tightening controls around Bikie activity. Although the case involved alleged associates rather than formal membership, it highlighted how quickly influence could spread through loosely connected social networks. State governments considered whether existing restrictions on gatherings, communication, and symbols were effective, or whether organised groups had evolved beyond the scope of current legislation. Some jurisdictions reviewed their enforcement powers, exploring whether improvements were needed to give police more flexibility when responding to emerging risks. Another area of reform centred on border control and identity verification. The fact that Rodrigo had allegedly travelled out of Australia using documentation that bypassed detection underscored vulnerabilities within the system. Government departments initiated internal reviews to determine how the passport was obtained, what safeguards had been missed, and how future cases could be prevented. Discussions arose about strengthening identity verification processes, improving real-time data sharing between agencies, and implementing updated technological systems capable of flagging irregularities earlier. International cooperation also received renewed attention. The pursuit had involved multiple countries, each with different protocols and administrative requirements. While many aspects of the operation had been successful, the delays experienced across various jurisdictions highlighted the challenges of coordinating complex cases. Australia began exploring opportunities to expand bilateral agreements, enhance communication pathways, and streamline extradition processes where possible. Officials acknowledged that international collaboration was essential for managing transnational crime, but needed ongoing refinement to keep pace with evolving criminal strategies. Beyond policy reform, the case left significant social and cultural traces. Australians from different regions reflected on how someone could move through communities, workplaces, and social groups while developing connections to networks capable of causing significant harm. The idea that Rodrigo had grown up in Sydney's suburbs, attended ordinary schools, and lived within neighbourhoods. Familiar to thousands, raised uncomfortable questions about visibility and oversight. These reflections were not about attributing blame to individuals or institutions, but about acknowledging that early signs can be easily missed when they appear gradual or normalized. Community leaders, educators, and youth workers participated in discussions about the importance of early intervention. They highlighted the need to strengthen support systems for young people who feel isolated, disconnected, or drawn toward identities that offer belonging through risk. Conversations emerged about mentoring programs, school engagement strategies, and community-based initiatives designed to provide alternative pathways for young men who might otherwise drift into harmful environments. These discussions did not portray Rodrigo as a representative of all such individuals, but used the case as a starting point for reflecting on broader patterns. The impact on families affected by drug-related harm was equally significant. For many, the case reopened painful memories and fueled renewed calls for stronger measures against illicit substance supply. Organisations advocating for harm prevention used the case to highlight the flow-on effects of drug distribution networks. They emphasised that the consequences extended far beyond criminal circles, shaping the lives of families who had never encountered organised crime directly. Their advocacy focused on improving community education, expanding treatment options, and investing in preventative services rather than relying solely on punitive responses. Across NES, police and legal experts examined the structural issues revealed by the case. They acknowledged that law enforcement had achieved significant outcomes, but also recognised that the process had exposed gaps in resources, technology, and coordination. Officers highlighted that organised crime networks were increasingly adaptive, using encrypted communication, decentralised hierarchies, and transnational links to operate in ways that challenged traditional policing methods. The case underscored the need for continual adaptation. It suggested that performance was not simply a matter of capability, but of alignment between agencies, systems, and community expectations. One of the most persistent questions to emerge from public discussion was simple yet confronting. How many others like him had moved through the same spaces unnoticed? It reflected a deeper anxiety about the invisibility of risk in everyday environments. People wondered whether similar trajectories might be unfolding quietly in other suburbs, schools, or social circles. The question was less about specific individuals and more about the systems designed to identify emerging vulnerabilities. It challenged communities to examine whether social structures encouraged early intervention or allowed gradual shifts to go unaddressed until they became entrenched. Media analysis following the case often focused on the tension between individual responsibility and systemic influence. Commentators acknowledged that the allegations against Rodrigo represented serious breaches of the law. Yet, they also noted that the path leading to such outcomes rarely develops in isolation. They discussed how social, economic, and cultural factors intersected with personal choices. This perspective did not diminish accountability, but expanded the conversation to include broader factors that shape risk over time. Within the legal sector, the case raised questions about capacity. Courts across Australia were already managing significant caseloads, and complex organised crime matters required extended hearings, specialised knowledge, and consistent resource allocation. The time required to process such cases highlighted the need for improved infrastructure, additional training for legal professionals, and reforms aimed at reducing bottlenecks. These challenges were not unique to Rodrigo's case, but were illuminated by it due to the public attention and cross-border elements involved. In law enforcement circles, the case became a teaching point. Training programs used it to illustrate the importance of intelligence gathering, cross-agency cooperation, and the challenges associated with international pursuit. Discussions also focused on the need for balanced approaches that respected legal boundaries, while responding effectively to sophisticated criminal networks. Officers emphasised that while the case showcased the success of coordinated policing, it also revealed opportunities for refinement. Even after the legal proceedings concluded, the story lingered in community memory. People recalled the images of Rodrigo being escorted across the tarmac, the details of the Kensington seizure, and the complexity of his international movements. These images became part of a narrative about the evolving nature of organised crime in Australia. They reinforced the idea that the underworld was not remote or disconnected, but intertwined with familiar neighbourhoods, workplaces, and public spaces. The legacy of the case also extended into discussions about resilience. Communities wanted assurance that systems were improving. They sought confirmation that gaps revealed by the investigation were being addressed, and that future cases would be managed with greater efficiency. Policymakers responded with statements about ongoing reforms, increased funding for specialist units, and improvements to international cooperation channels. Yet, for many, reassurance depended less on announcements and more on consistent, observable changes. As Australia reflected on the implications of the case, there was a shared sense of responsibility. People acknowledged that preventing similar trajectories required more than law enforcement alone. It required community vigilance, accessible social supports, and a willingness to engage with difficult conversations about risk, belonging, and unmet needs. This sense of responsibility did not suggest blame, but recognized that systems operate most effectively when supported by community awareness and early intervention. The shadow cast by the case served as a reminder of how easily harmful networks can develop when left unchallenged. It prompted Australians to consider the importance of paying attention to the quiet spaces where such networks take root. The story underscored that criminal influence does not always emerge loudly or dramatically. Sometimes it develops slowly, shaped by isolation, opportunity, and overlooked warning signs. In the end, the legacy of the Rodrigo Elices case lay not only in the charges, the pursuit, or the legal outcomes. It lay in the questions it left behind. It asked Australians to look closely at their systems, their communities, and their assumptions about safety. It invited reflection on how easily silence can allow harmful patterns to continue unchecked. And as the country absorbed the lessons of the case, one truth settled with quiet weight. Sometimes evil does not need to raise its voice. It only needs a silence that lasts too long.